In 1996, an issue of the journal Nature posted a discussion about what readers thought the last of a species should be called. Several options were offered up. How about ender or endling? Another reader, feeling that these were too weak, preferred terminarch, which she felt expressed more positivity. Still another reader put forth relict, feeling that this word already existed, so a new word need not be invented. Before long, endling was ultimately adopted, and the stories of endlings began to be told. This is a compilation of my 3 endling videos. We're going to look at several species and subspecies of plant and animal. Some have been extinct for a long time, while others are still with us. Their tales are tragic, serving as a stark reminder of how fragile our world can be and the role that we play in preserving its biodiversity. Welcome back to All About Nature. On my channel, I try to bring nature-related content that's both educational and entertaining. If you like this kind of content, then please consider liking the video, leaving a comment, or even subscribing to the channel. I really appreciate your support. In the salt marshes of Merritt Island in Florida, once lived a subspecies of seaside sparrow. It was known as the Dusky Seaside Sparrow because it had much darker coloration than the other subspecies. It also had a distinct call, which sounded like a buzz, much like that of an insect. While the birds would have been a welcome sight to locals, Merritt Island had another small inhabitant that the locals hated: mosquitoes. In the 1940s, the chemical DDT began to be used as a form of mosquito control, but it also had a seriously negative impact on birds. The chemical reduced the breeding abilities of female birds, and it caused the shells of their eggs to be so thin that even a slight bump could break them. It was a devastating blow to the Dusky Seaside Sparrow, and their numbers crashed. The birds nested in the marshes on the island, but in an effort to further control the mosquito population, the marshes were flooded, and the Dusky Seaside Sparrow's nests were destroyed. By the time DDT was finally banned in 1972, it was too late. Ongoing pesticide use killed off or contaminated the sparrow's remaining food sources, and 1975 marked the last time that a female was sighted. In 1976, only 6 sparrows could be found, all of which were males. In an effort to better track the Dusky Seaside Sparrows, they were all tagged with a different colored band: green, red, yellow, white, blue, and orange. After banding the birds and observing their movements, scientists made an interesting discovery. The Dusky Seaside Sparrows rarely traveled more than 1 or 2 miles from the place that they were born. The different banded birds were not all living in the same vicinity, so this meant that they were each living alone, unable to find any other of their kind. From 1976 to 1978, Orange Band was isolated in the St. John unit of the St. John's National Wildlife Reserve. Researchers were surprised when he did something uncharacteristic of this subspecies. In 1978, after years of living alone, Orange Band disappeared from his tiny range. When he popped up again, he was 8 miles further south in the Beeline unit, where he had finally found another member of his own species. He was observed living alongside Blue Band. In 1980, the decision was made to round up the remaining 6 birds and bring them into a captive breeding program. No females existed, but the goal of the program was to create hybrids by mating the Dusky Seaside Sparrow males with the similar Scott's Seaside Sparrow. 5 of the 6 birds were captured, but Green Band couldn't be caught. He was seen one last time in July, and then never seen again. While in the breeding program, Red Band also died of a tumor. The remaining 4 birds were moved to a small island reserve in Walt Disney World, known as Discovery Island. The breeding program wasn't overly successful, only ever producing 5 hybrid chicks. It was believed that the hybrids weren't capable of passing on the Dusky Seaside Sparrow's coloration, so the breeding program was abandoned, and all of the offspring either died or escaped. Over the next 3 years, yellow band, white band, and blue band would die, leaving orange band as the endling for the Dusky Seaside Sparrow. In 1987, orange band was very old. He was at least 8 and possibly as old as 13. He was blind in one eye and had been living on Discovery Island all alone for over a year. On June 17th of 1987, he was found dead, and the Dusky Seaside Sparrow was officially declared extinct. Located in the Indian Ocean, the Mascarene Islands are the famous home of one of the most iconic extinct species of all time, the dodo. Human arrival wiped out dozens of species on the island, mostly birds and giant tortoises, but it also had a devastating impact on the plant life of the Mascarenes. The first settlement on the island of Mauritius was in 1598. As the settlers ate their way through the local fauna, they also cleared the dense forests that covered the island for lumber, firewood, and agriculture. Today, only 5% of the original forest remains. One of the species of tree that used to be abundant on the mountains of the island was Hyophorbe Amicis. This palm grows to about 12 meters tall, has a thin gray trunk, and a small set of leaves at the very top. While once abundant, today there is only one left in the entire world. In 1870, the Currapee Botanic Gardens were established. It has an informal layout, and included within is the last specimen of Hyophorbe Amicis. No one knows if this specimen was deliberately moved and planted into the garden, or if it was growing there when the garden was established and just never removed. And as the forests were cut down around the island, the garden acted as an unintentional sanctuary for this tree. In the 19th and 20th centuries, the palm was popular in botanic gardens around the world. But 2 world wars meant that all of the international specimens were destroyed. In the 1970s, botanists went searching for it again, and quickly realized that not only were there none being kept internationally, but that all of the wild trees had also been destroyed. Today, that last specimen has been given the nickname of the loneliest plant in the world. Unlike other species of plant that are known from only a single specimen, no one has ever succeeded at propagating H. amaricauli. While seedlings have been produced through in vitro germination, they all died shortly after sprouting. So the loneliest plant continues to stand alone in the Currapee Botanic Gardens, and is likely the next species to join the long list of extinct flora and fauna from the Mascarenes. One of the largest bovine species to ever walk the earth used to flourish across Europe, Asia, and North Africa. The Aurochs was huge, standing about 1.8 meters tall at the shoulder and having horns as much as 80 centimeters long. As cattle were being domesticated in the Near East and South Asia, Aurochs were used to produce the first ever livestock. This means that today, Aurochs genes survive in many of the varieties of domestic cattle farmed around the world. Despite domestication, wild herds were hunted regularly by humans, and around 3,000 years ago, they disappeared from much of their range, only managing to hold on in Central and Eastern Europe. By the 16th century, the clear-cutting of forests and overhunting by people had reduced their range to a single marshy forest in Poland. Only 50 animals remained. Hunting aurochs became the privilege of nobility, with aurochs horns becoming greatly prized. In 1626, the last male aurochs died, and his horns were collected by the King of Poland. Only a single cow remained, wandering the forests alone. In 1627, she died of old age, and with her, the species was gone. There is some recent evidence that some aurochs may have survived in Bulgaria a few decades longer, but the female in Poland is the last individual humans knew about, and is generally considered to be the endling of the species. Today there are efforts to try to breed domestic cattle back to something that is as close as possible in appearance to an aurochs. They've been released into wild spaces in an effort to restore prehistoric landscapes. While superficially these cattle are similar to aurochs, genetically they aren't the same, and the main breeding program was abandoned in 2018 after nearly a century of operation. On the Iberian Peninsula in southwestern Europe lives a species of mountain goat with long horns and relatively short legs, the Iberian Ibex. 4 subspecies are recognized: the southeastern, the western, the Portuguese, and Pyrenean. But today, only 2 survive. Over the past few centuries, all 4 subspecies have declined significantly. Hunting pressures, agricultural development, and environmental deterioration all contributed to the species becoming increasingly rare. In 1886, the Portuguese Ibex was down to the final herd of around a dozen animals. Because it's the males that were primarily targeted because of their large horns, the remaining ibexes were all female. In 1889, an old female was captured and photographed. This is the only photograph in existence of the Portuguese Ibex. Sadly, the animal in the photograph didn't survive in captivity, and within 3 days of this picture being captured, she died. The final sighting of a living Portuguese Ibex was in 1892, and with her death, the Portuguese Ibex was gone. Another of the subspecies, the Pyrenean Ibex, was the next to fall. Known in Spanish as the bucardo, the Pyrenean Ibex lived in the northern Pyrenees Mountains, in Spain and southern France. It faced the same pressures the Portuguese Ibex had faced, and by the 1950s, only a small population remained in Ordesa National Park. Poaching likely continued even after it was banned, but the main threat to the Pyrenean Ibex changed to something new. Farmers were bringing their livestock to graze in the park more and more. Sheep, goats, cattle, and horses were all consuming the grasses before the Ibex could. And to make matters worse, other ungulates had been introduced to the region, including fallow deer and mouflon. The Pyrenean Ibex couldn't compete. By the end of the 20th century, they were down to their last surviving member, a female that was nicknamed Celia. She was captured and tranquilized on April 20th, 1999, and a small clipping from her ear was taken so her genome could be sequenced. On January 6th, 2000, a fir tree fell on her and killed her. The Pyrenean Ibex became the first extinction of the 21st century, but amazingly, they wouldn't stay extinct. 3 years later, using the genome sequenced from her ear clipping, scientists managed to clone Celia. On July 30th, 2003, her clone was born, but she immediately showed signs of respiratory distress. It turned out that she had abnormalities in her lungs that had gone undetected. After only a few minutes, the newborn kid died, making the Pyrenean Ibex the only animal to have ever gone extinct twice. In 2005, a large new species of tree frog was discovered in Panama. Given the common name of Rabbs' fringe-limbed tree frog, the species was truly unique. For one, it was a gliding species of frog, able to use its webbed hands and feet to soar from the canopy of trees to safety as it attempted to elude predators. But their breeding behavior was by far the most unique thing about them. The species laid eggs in water-filled tree holes, where the males fiercely guarded their territories from other males. After the eggs were laid and the tadpoles hatched, the males would continue to care for and feed their offspring. It was the only known species of frog where the young survived by eating the skin cells of their fathers. The tree frogs went extinct from a combination of two factors. One problem was their incredibly small range. They were only known from a small area of cloud forest on the Pacific-facing slopes of a single mountain range, and it's estimated that their total range covered no more than 100 square kilometers. The other problem was an outbreak of the amphibian chytrid fungus within their range. This fungal infection thickens the skins of amphibians, causing their organs to shut down, and almost always kills any frog that it infests. Scientists knew that the fungus was going to cause problem for the new species, so in 2006, the scientists that discovered these tree frogs made a crucial decision. All of the specimens of Rabbs' fringe-limbed tree frog that had been collected to describe the species were sent to facilities in Panama and the United States to safeguard them against extinction. It was just in time, too. The amphibian chytrid fungus outbreak hit and rapidly decimated the only known wild population of the species. The last wild documentation of Rabbs' fringe-limbed tree frog was in 2007, when a single male was recorded calling in the mating season. After that, no specimen was ever recorded alive in the wild again, and only the captive population remained. In captivity, the species thrived, but replicating their breeding conditions proved to be too difficult. This is because the researchers hadn't gotten a chance yet to perform an in-depth study of the species' breeding habits before it disappeared. The captive frogs would breed, but the tadpoles would almost immediately die. So one by one, as the captive frogs died, the species inched towards extinction. Their fate was sealed when the last female died in 2009 at the Atlanta Botanical Gardens. By 2012, there were only 2 males left. One of them was suffering from declining health, and the decision was made to euthanize it. The species had its endling. The last of Rabbs' fringe-limbed tree frogs survived at Zoo Atlanta and was given the nickname Toughie. He was kept in a special enclosure called the frog pod, which ensured that he wasn't exposed to any pathogen that would shorten his life. While captive frogs had mated, none of the males had ever been observed performing breeding vocalizations in captivity. That is until December 14th, 2014. For the first time ever since arriving at the zoo, Toughie began to sing. Of course, there was no way he could know that he was the sole remaining survivor of his species, and no female would ever come. On September 26, 2016, being an estimated 12 years old, Toughie died at Zoo Atlanta. While we can't yet say for certain that some wild population of Rabbs' fringe-limbed tree frog won't be found holding on in an unexplored part of Panama, it seems that the species has been lost forever. The IUCN still lists it as critically endangered, though it's unlikely that they will ever be seen again. Binomial nomenclature, where species were internationally identified by 2 Latin names, one for the genus and one for the species, began in Europe in 1751. As a result, most of the earliest species to be scientifically named were European. One such animal was the Great Auk. Great auks lived throughout the North Atlantic. They stood as much as 85 centimeters tall and weighed as much as 5 kilograms. They were black and white flightless birds that spent the majority of their time hunting for fish in the open ocean. The scientific name given to them was Pinguinus impennis, and they were among the first birds to be called penguins. Interestingly, the birds that we call penguins today got their name from European scientists who thought that they looked similar to the Great Auk, who had the name first. Great auks only nested on tiny remote rocky islands that were surrounded by waters abundant in fish. These islands weren't very common, so the birds had limited nesting sites. When they weren't breeding on small islands, they could be found swimming in the waters of the North Atlantic. At one point, their range stretched from the Mediterranean to Greenland to Florida. They became an important species to many people groups. In North America, indigenous people regularly hunted and consumed the great auks, occasionally using their skins to make clothing. In Europe, they were an important source of feathers, and sailors regularly consumed the birds on their long voyages. The hunting was ruthless and cruel. One sailor named Aaron Thomas described the butchering like this: "If you come for their feathers, you do not give yourself the trouble of killing them, but lay hold of one and pluck the best of the feathers. You then turn the poor penguin adrift, with his skin half naked and torn off, to perish at his leisure. This is not a very humane method, but it is the common practice. While you abide on this island, you are in the constant practice of horrid cruelties, for you not only skin them alive, but you burn them alive also, to cook their bodies with. You take a kettle with you in which to put a penguin or two. You kindle a fire under it, and this fire is absolutely made of the unfortunate penguins themselves. Their bodies, being oily, soon produce a flame. There is no wood on the island." As the population of Europe grew, the hunting pressure on the great auks became so great that they disappeared from much of the waters surrounding the continent. Then, as Europe entered the age of science, the hobbies of the wealthiest members of society began to threaten the species further. Taxidermy, feathers, and egg collections all became a means of flaunting one's wealth and status. The rarer the species, the more sought after it became. This meant that a growing number of people got into the business of trophy hunting, and they were willing to go as far as necessary to capture their trophies. By the end of the 18th century, the breeding range of the great auk had become seriously limited. They were only known to have nesting colonies in 5 locations: Funk Island, Grimsey Island, Eldey Island, the Gulf of St. Lawrence, and the St. Kilda Islands. By the 19th century, the great auks were extremely rare. The last great auk in the British Isles was collected from St. Kilda in 1840. The sailors who caught it kept it alive for 3 days, being puzzled by its tiny wings. But when their boat was hit by a storm, they believed that the great auk was actually a witch who had summoned it. So they took sticks and ended its life in an effort to get the storm to stop. The species became limited to Eldey Island. The island is a tall rock jutting straight up out of the ocean. As a result, the great auks could only go ashore on one side, and there was only space for about 25 pairs of nesting birds. Once the colony was discovered, the race was on to see who would get to add the birds to their collections first. Museums and private collectors all wanted a great auk before the species was gone, so men were paid high sums to travel out to Eldey Island and capture an auk or two and collect their eggs. By 1844, only 1 pair of great auks remained on the island, sitting on the last egg of their species. And on June 3rd, 2 collectors went ashore to finish them off. They had been paid by a merchant to collect the adults and their egg. As they rushed to capture the birds and strangle them before they escaped into the water, one of them accidentally stepped on the last egg and destroyed it. The last known breeding population of great auks was gone, but somewhere the species held on. It isn't known where the remaining bird or birds may have been hiding, but the species had a final surprise. The last great auk was found 8 years after the last nesting colony was destroyed. In 1852, a single bird was spotted off the coast of Newfoundland, Canada. This bird may have been the great auk's endling. The birds were estimated to have a lifespan of as much as 25 years. Was this last Great Auk swimming the oceans alone for nearly a decade, trying to find a colony to be part of? Or did a small colony of Great Auks manage to survive somewhere near Canada or Greenland? We may never know. But by 1860, the species was almost certainly extinct. Today, there are talks about bringing the Great Auk back through the science of de-extinction. While no official project has begun, the species is considered a good candidate due to its relatively recent extinction and the extreme role that humans played in their unnecessary demise. Robert White was a surgeon with the East India Company who lived in India. He had a passion for botany and spent much of his free time scientifically describing species of plant. Over the course of his life, he was responsible for describing 1,267 species, thanks in large part to the Indian collectors and illustrators that he worked alongside. In 1835, around the time the great auks were going extinct, he was exploring the western Ghats of southern India when he came across a species of evergreen tree, which he described as Maduka diplostemon. The tree had bright, glossy leaves and a thick, twisted trunk. But after being described, the species faded into the pages of history. For the next 184 years, no one could find the tree. It was assumed to have possibly gone extinct, but that all changed in 2019. Botanists were assessing trees found in the sacred grove of a temple in Kerala when they noticed something strange about one of the trees. It had been assumed to be Maduka neraifolia, but closer examination confirmed that the tree was actually Maduka diplostemon. After nearly 2 centuries, the species had finally been rediscovered. They searched through the sacred groves of other temples in the area in hopes of finding another, but none could be found. The tree in the sacred grove of the temple was the endling for the species. Researchers also noticed that the tree was in trouble. For starters, there was a small retaining wall around its base, made out of concrete paving tiles. The wall negatively affected the tree's vigor, and it wasn't able to thrive. Being surrounded by concrete and buildings meant that it was also much hotter around the tree than it would have been if it were in a more natural setting. The heat stress was causing it to flower earlier than it was supposed to. The early flowering meant that very little fruit was being produced, and the little fruit that did manage to form was being quickly eaten by birds and bats. The researchers faced another problem. With the tree being situated in a temple, it wasn't just for decoration. The tree was giving shade to 2 different gods that were regularly venerated under the tree. This meant that getting permission to do any work to save the tree was going to be difficult. They wanted to collect some of the fallen seeds, but they were initially met with opposition. The seeds had fallen into a place of worship and couldn't be touched. Thankfully, the following year, the temple authorities allowed them to finally obtain some of the seeds, and they began to attempt to germinate them. It didn't take long for some seedlings to be produced. On June 5th of 2023, the first seedling was planted, and the tree in the temple was no longer an endling. The new seedling was planted in a secondary school by the Honorable Chief Minister of Kerala on World Environmental Day, and researchers continue to grow seedlings in an effort to keep the species from going extinct. In the United States, 2 species of bird went extinct right around the same time, one at the start of World War I and one right at the end. While the stories of how they disappeared are distinct, the stories of their endlings cross in a surprising way. North America was once home to the most abundant bird on the planet, the passenger pigeon. They once numbered as high as 5 billion birds. Their flocks were immense and awe-inspiring, with billions of birds darkening the sky for hours or even days at a time as they migrated. They played a crucial role in the ecosystems of eastern Canada and the United States, being responsible for huge amounts of seed dispersal and being prey for many species higher up on the food chain. Before European arrival, the eastern part of North America was covered in a dense deciduous forest. The native peoples of the region relied on the passenger pigeon as a major food source, and they would often move closer to nesting colonies during breeding season to have easier access to the birds. But European arrival to North America happened faster than nature could keep up with. The forests were cut down for human settlement and agriculture. The birds were hunted by the tens of thousands. With the arrival of the gun to North America, passenger pigeons didn't stand a chance. As many as 60 birds could be killed with a single shot from a shotgun. And at the peak of hunting, as many as 50,000 birds were being killed daily. The pigeons were viewed as an endless source of protein, so even as their numbers dwindled, nothing was done to protect them. By the 1880s, only a few nesting sites remained, and finally, people began to get worried about the birds. Laws were passed to protect them, but they were almost entirely ignored. The passenger pigeons covered huge distances in their migrations, and at any point along the way, they could meet hunters or trappers. In 1895, the last nest and egg were recorded in Minnesota. In 1901 and 1902, 2 of the last wild pigeons were shot and killed. These were the last confirmed sightings of the birds in the wild. The pigeons had been kept in private aviaries and zoos across Europe and North America, and around the time that they were disappearing from the wild, only 3 captive populations remained in zoos. 1 in Wisconsin, 1 in Illinois, and 1 in Ohio. These populations were descended from single mating pairs, which meant that their genetic diversity was weak. As a result, they became more and more inbred until the birds could no longer mate and produce viable offspring. In 1909, the birds kept in Wisconsin and Illinois were all gone, and only 3 passenger pigeons remained in the Cincinnati Zoo in Ohio, 2 males and a female. In April of that year, one of the males died, and the last 2 pigeons were named George and Martha, after George Washington and his wife. In 1910, George died, and Martha was left as the endling of her species. She would survive alone for 4 more years. Her cage was in the style of a Chinese pagoda and measured 5.4 by 6 meters. But Martha was old. Estimates vary, but it's generally agreed that Martha was hatched in the zoo in 1889, which means that she was over 20 years old by the time George died. She became slow and essentially stopped moving. This annoyed visitors to the zoo who wanted to see her being active in her cage. They would throw sand at her to get her to move, which eventually led to zoo staff roping off her enclosure. On September 1st, 1914, Martha died in her cage, and her body was later taxidermied and put on display in the Smithsonian Institution. The passenger pigeon, the most numerous bird in recorded history, had met its end in a small cage in Cincinnati, but this wasn't the only endling to call this cage home. Another North American bird that went extinct around the same time was a truly unique species of parrot known as the Carolina Parakeet. These brightly colored parakeets once spread as far north as southern Canada, and throughout the majority of their range, they are the only indigenous species of parrot known to have existed. The birds were gregarious and fed on the seeds and fruits of various plants, though they had a preference for the seeds of cockleburs. They lived in marshy areas with old-growth forest, where they nested in tree cavities. Up to 300 birds were observed living in a single flock, and around the time of European arrival, they could be found from New York to Florida to Colorado. But the birds quickly began to disappear. Deforestation was their main threat, but not the only one. They were also hunted for their feathers and to adorn women's hats. They were occasionally kept as pets, and they were seen as pests and killed by farmers. The birds had a flocking behavior that meant that they would return en masse to the body of a fallen member, allowing farmers to easily destroy all of the birds in a flock in one go. By the 1800s, the Carolina parakeet was pretty rare in most of its range. The greatest concentration of the birds was now found in Florida and the remaining marshes around the Mississippi River. But those marshes continued to be cleared for their timber, and in 1878, the last parakeets outside of Florida were spotted in Kentucky. Thankfully, a relatively healthy population remained in a small area of central Florida, and in 1896, large flocks and breeding pairs were observed. There was hope that the species would continue to hold on in the remaining range, but over the next couple of years, something strange happened. The population crashed, and by the early 20th century, only a few wild birds remained. To this day, no one really knows what caused the wild flocks to disappear. Their nest sites weren't destroyed, and deforestation and hunting weren't issues in the area. It's speculated that a disease likely wiped out the majority of the remaining birds, though this theory cannot be proven. 1904 marked the last confirmed sighting of a wild bird, and the species had become limited to its captive population. In 1914, after Martha died at the Cincinnati Zoo, a pair of captive Carolina parakeets were moved into the enclosure. Incas and Lady Jane were a bonded pair, and would remain together in the enclosure for 3 years. They had arrived in the zoo in 1885, and had been a breeding pair for 29 years by the time they were moved into the Chinese pagoda. While the pair laid eggs every year, they would always roll them out of their nests and destroy them. In 1917, Lady Jane died at the age of 32, and Incas became the last known Carolina parakeet in the world. With the death of his partner, Incas became listless and mournful. He was less active and lost the gregarious behavior he had been known for. On the night of February 21, 1918, the temperature in Cincinnati dropped to an unseasonable -14 degrees centigrade. Within 48 hours, Incas was gone, having died in the exact same cage that Martha had died in only 4 years prior. Incas's body was frozen and sent to the Smithsonian Institution, just like Martha's was, but it never made it. The location of his body is unknown to this day, and only a few pictures of him remain. The passenger pigeon and the Carolina parakeet once flourished together in the deciduous forests of the American East, but over the course of only 4 years, both of their species came to an end in the same Chinese pagoda in the same small zoo in Cincinnati, Ohio. On the island of Oahu, in the Hawaiian archipelago, once lived a species of snail with a brown shell that had a yellow tip. The Oahu tree snail was found above 400 meters of elevation, where the species fed on fungus that grew on the surface of various trees and shrubs. But in the 1980s, they were almost gone. They were listed as endangered, and scientists began to monitor the species much more closely. In 1996, the snails were reassessed as critically endangered, and the following year, scientists took drastic measures to try to save them. All of the remaining wild snails were captured and moved into breeding facilities to protect them. But from what? Throughout the time that humans have been living on the Hawaiian Islands, species have been introduced. But in the 20th century, it got much worse. In the 1930s, the massive African land snail was introduced to the islands, where it began to wreak havoc on native and non-native plants. By the 1950s, farmers were desperate for a solution. This was when someone got an idea. In order to stop the African land snails, perhaps the species needed to have a predator introduced. So, someone brought over the rosy wolf snail from the southeastern United States. This predatory snail hunts out snails and slugs to consume, and farmers were hopeful that soon the African land snails would be gone. But that's not what happened. While young African land snails were potential prey for the much smaller rosy wolf snail, they weren't the most convenient. So the rosy wolf snails began to hunt down the native Hawaiian snails instead. The rosy wolf snail eventually played a part in eating at least 9 species of native Hawaiian snail into extinction. So in 1997, collecting all of the remaining wild snails was the only way to keep them from being consumed into extinction. Scientists managed to get the Oahu tree snails to mate in captivity, but for some reason, the young would never survive. But that changed in 2005, when for the first and last time, a single offspring was hatched that managed to make it through infancy. Researchers continued to try to get the snails to reproduce, and they regularly searched in the wild for any remaining survivors. But by April 2011, no wild snails could be found, and all the captive snails had died, except for the one that they had managed to hatch. They named him George, after Lonesome George, a famous endling of tortoise from the Galapagos Islands. Amazingly, he managed to live for another 8 years. But on New Year's Day 2019, George was found dead in his enclosure. He was 14 years old. The loss of this species isn't only due to the introduction of the rosy wolf snail. Almost everything was stacked against the species. Introduced rats, chameleons, and flatworms also preyed on the snails. Deforestation, change in land use, and native plant destruction by domesticated livestock all had an impact. And even the traditional practice of collecting snails to make leis contributed to the loss of the species. In fact, this family of snails, which only a couple of centuries ago had about 750 total species across the South Pacific, has experienced an extinction rate of between 75 and 90%. The story of George is just one of hundreds that could be told. The story of the thylacine has been covered in depth on this channel before. In fact, I have an hour-long video on the species that took me a month to research and produce. But one thing I didn't cover in depth in that video was the recent discovery of the true identity of the last thylacine. The thylacine was a dog-sized marsupial carnivore that was once found throughout Australia and New Guinea. But around 40,000 years ago, the majority of the megafauna in the region began to disappear. A changing climate and hunting from the newly arrived humans meant that the thylacine became rarer and rarer. A little over 3,000 years ago, the thylacine disappeared from the mainland and from New Guinea, and their sole surviving population became limited to the island of Tasmania. When Europeans arrived on the island in the 17th century, they encountered the animal but couldn't really tell what exactly it was. It looked like a dog, and so was regularly described as a wolf. It also had stripes, leading to it being called a tiger. But strangest of all, it had a pouch for carrying its young, meaning it was actually more similar to a kangaroo than to either a dog or a cat. Today, it's commonly called the Tasmanian tiger, though a more accurate name for the species is the thylacine. They've cemented a place among cryptozoology enthusiasts due to their unique appearance and the possibility that they may be surviving somewhere across their vast range. People around the world still claim to see them, and several people have devoted their entire lives to rediscovering them. But the reality is that there hasn't been a confirmed sighting of a thylacine in the wild since 1930. The thylacines were hated because they were seen as being a threat to livestock. Whether they actually ate the sheep or chickens of farmers or not is actually up for debate. Regardless, the farmers didn't want them around. the government of Tasmania set up a bounty system to protect livestock. For each adult head of a thylacine submitted, £1 would be paid, and for each pup head, 10 shillings. The bounty system ran for 21 years, until 1909, and in total 2,184 bounties were paid. However, during this time, many more thylacines were killed than were reported. As the species became rarer and rarer, zoos around the world wanted them more and more. The species was kept in zoos in North America, Europe, and across Australia. In 1930, Wilf Batty, a farmer in Tasmania, spotted a thylacine on his property. Fearing for his chickens, he did what any farmer in the region would have done at the time. He got his gun and he shot it. What he didn't understand was that the species was so rare at that point that no other confirmed sighting of a wild thylacine would ever occur. Over the next few years, the species got down to its final captive specimen, a sole animal at the Hobart Zoo in Tasmania. In 1933, naturalist David Flier went to the Hobart Zoo to film the species endling. He captured a series of shots of the animal wandering around its cage, yawning and sniffing the air. He was reportedly bitten by the animal as he filmed it. On September 7, 1936, the last thylacine at the Hobart Zoo died. Sightings of wild animals continued, but no other confirmed evidence of the species has ever surfaced. Fast forward to 1968, and the story of the endling was finally told. A man named Frank Darby claimed to have worked at the Hobart Zoo at the time that their last thylacine died. He said that it was a male named Benjamin, and that the zoo fed it live rabbits to entertain the public. When reporters tracked down Alison Reed, whose father was known to have worked with the last thylacine, she was offended by what Darby had said. Not only did she claim that they had never fed the animal live rabbits, but she also pointed out that Darby had described the animal as voiceless and mute, which was totally untrue. Regardless, the story of Benjamin the last thylacine persisted for decades. That is until 2022. At the Tasmanian Museum and Art Gallery, Dr. Catherine Medlock was doing an audit of the archival records, including the taxidermy reports, when she noticed something strange. A thylacine specimen was catalogued that didn't match up with the story of Benjamin. It had a collection date of 1936, the very year that the last captive thylacine died. She teamed up with Dr. Robert Paddle to solve the mystery. First, they looked through all the thylacine remains in the museum's zoological collection, but none of them matched up. This was when they realized that it may have been erroneously catalogued, so they checked the education collection. There, they discovered a skin of a thylacine that matched the one in the records. It turns out that the skin had been used in a touring science exhibit for years following the species' extinction. The specimen even had a flat area where countless children had been allowed to touch it. And then for decades, it had sat unnoticed in a cupboard at the museum. This was when the story of Benjamin and the true identity of the last thylacine at the Hobart Zoo finally came to light. In May 1936, a respected Tasmanian bushman named Elias Churchill was setting up illegal snare traps in the center of the island, when to his surprise, he captured a female thylacine. Because he didn't want to get fined for using snare traps, he couldn't announce what he caught. Instead, he went to the Hobart Zoo, where a secret deal was made. The living female thylacine was purchased and put on display. Only 2 months after this deal was made, thylacines were given official protected status in Australia, but it was way too late. Only 59 days later, on September 7, 1936, the last thylacine at the Hobart Zoo, which was actually a female, died. Sadly, it seems that she died of neglect. She had been locked out of her sleeping shelter and exposed to the elements. At the time that she died, Hobart had experienced unseasonably hot days and freezing cold nights. Without protection from the elements, she couldn't make it. So the real endling of the thylacines was an unnamed female who had been snared out of the forests and spent her final months suffering in a small enclosure at the Hobart Zoo. Her skull and skin remain on display at the Tasmanian Museum and Art Gallery. In the middle of the ocean, halfway between New Zealand and New Caledonia, are three small islands known as Norfolk, Phillip, and Nepean Island. On October 10, 1774, James Cook came across them and put them on the map. While some recent evidence suggests that Polynesians had some small settlements there in the past, when Cook and his crew arrived, the islands had no human population, instead abounding with unique flora and fauna. German naturalist Johann Reinhold Forster and his son George were accompanying Cook on this voyage. They were the first to describe a new species of parrot that was found on both Norfolk and Phillip Island. The Norfolk Island kaka was a large parrot that was said to live both on the ground and on the trees. It had an olive-green back and orange, red, and yellow cheeks and underparts. It had a long curved bill and large feet and legs. 16 years after it was discovered, in 1780, a sailor named John Hunter was shipwrecked on Norfolk Island, and while he was there, he took to drawing the local wildlife. One of the images he produced was this bird, an orange and green parrot depicted on a kangaroo apple. It is the only image that has ever been produced of the species based off of a specimen in the wild. A new penal colony on Norfolk Island had been established in 1788, and this small colony of prisoners was going to put an end to the bird. To support the penal colony, large parts of the island were cleared for agriculture. When the prisoners wanted meat, they often took to hunting the local wildlife, and the kaka was a prime target. While we know very little about their biology, the parrots were similar to their New Zealand cousins. They were clumsy flyers and spent most of their time on the ground. They were also naturally inquisitive and approached people without fear. By the 1830s, the kakas had been eradicated from Norfolk Island. It was around this time that the drawing made by Hunter was noticed by the famous English ornithologist John Gould. Gould didn't recognize the orange and green parrot in the drawing. He described it as Nestor productus and set out to learn more about the species, but he had no idea that the parrots were already gone from Norfolk Island. Over the next few years, it was realized that the species also lived on the nearby Phillip Island, and a few birds were collected and placed in zoos and private collections. At least one of the birds was being kept in the Sydney Zoo. Gould managed to study it, producing drawings that were much truer to life than the one produced by Hunter. He also tried to surmise as much as he could about the bird's biology, based on its behavior in captivity. The specimen at the Sydney Zoo had been collected by Major Anderson. Anderson said that the birds fed on nectar, walked on the ground, and only flew up into the canopies to eat or to nest. Their nests, according to Anderson, were made in tree hollows and contained clutches of 4 eggs. Most of the information provided by Major Anderson cannot be confirmed, but Gould noted that the size and shape of the Norfolk Island kaka's beak likely meant that the species also fed on seeds and grubs found in rotting wood. Another specimen being kept in the London Zoo was also observed by Gould. By 1850, it was the last surviving member of the species known in the entire world. The endling was being fed vegetables, fruit juices, and dairy products like cheese. Gould observed that the bird made a strange call, which he described as being similar to the bark of a dog. When the specimen at the London Zoo died in 1851, the species was more than likely extinct. It's possible that a tiny population remained on Phillip Island for a while longer, but introduced pigs, goats, rabbits, and cats would have put an end to the remaining parrots in a short period of time. Today, only 16 skins of the Norfolk Island kaka are known to exist in museums, and all of them were collected from Phillip Island in the early 1800s. Between 15 and 20 million years ago, on another set of islands in the Pacific, a family of birds emerged. This family, the Mohoidae, became known as the Hawaiian honeyeaters, and at least 7 species developed. They were spread out across the islands, where they fed primarily on the nectar of flowers. Early Polynesian settlers of Hawaii regularly hunted birds for meat, and at least one of the species of honeyeater is known to have been hunted to extinction before European contact. But in 1778, the first Europeans arrived in Hawaii, and the introduction of species that would ensue would cause major changes to the ecology of the island chain. Cats, rats, mongooses, and most devastatingly for the birds, mosquitoes were all introduced. Mosquitoes carried with them diseases that the birds of Hawaii had never encountered before, and their populations were quickly decimated. The huge influx of new settlers also meant that large portions of the forest were cleared. Of the 6 species of honeyeater that still survived on the islands, 4 were extinct by the 20th century. In 1934, the last Hawaii o'o died, leaving only one living species in the entire family, the Kauai o'o. The Kauai o'o lived only on the island of Kauai, and it made its nests in the hollows of large trees. As the mosquitoes took over lowland forests, the birds were pushed higher up the mountains. Unfortunately, the trees at higher altitudes lacked sufficient cavities for nesting. Few, if any, of the birds were able to produce young, and by the 1960s, less than 40 remained. In the 1970s, John L. Sincock captured this video. It's the only known footage of the Kauai o'o. He also made recordings of the species' call. By 1981, only one pair of the birds survived on the island. In 1982, Hurricane Iwa came through, and the last female Kauai o'o died. The endling of the species was a male, and he survived alone on the mountain forests of Kauai for 5 years. He was occasionally observed feeding on nectar or hopping through the canopy. At times he wasn't seen at all, just heard singing. His call echoed out into a forest that held no more of his kind. He was recorded for the last time in 1987. In the year 2000, the IUCN declared the species extinct, bringing the last of the 7 species in this ancient family of birds to an end. This is the first entire family of bird species to go extinct in modern times. Hawaii has some of the highest rates of extinction today. Of the 142 endemic Hawaiian bird species, 95 are already gone. While not yet classified as extinct, the Baiji is assumed to be gone. This river dolphin was native to the Yangtze River in China. In Chinese folklore, the Baiji was the reincarnation of a beautiful young girl who died as she escaped from her stepfather. The species was nicknamed the Goddess of the Yangtze and was considered to be the protector of fishermen. But beginning in the 1950s, China began its great leap forward. This was an economic and social campaign led by the Chinese Communist Party. While the country saw major economic growth, it also began to secularize under government pressure, and people stopped venerating the Baiji as a goddess. The population of China also exploded, and the Yangtze River began to be used more and more for fishing and for transportation. The Baiji was regularly struck by ships and killed for meat and leather. The water became polluted, and the Baiji population shrank extremely quickly. By the 1880s, They were practically gone from the river system, and scientists knew that the species was on the brink of extinction. In 1994, the Chinese government delivered another blow to the species when they began construction on the Three Gorges Dam. The massive project cut straight through the Yangtze River and was later determined to have played a direct role in the disappearance of the Baiji. Back in 1980, a 2-year-old Baiji was accidentally caught in a fishing net. He was taken to the Institute of Hydrobiology at the Chinese Academy of Sciences, where he was raised and studied for 23 years. He was named Kiki. A survey for the Baiji in 1997 found only 13 dolphins remaining in the wild, and Kiki was the only captive specimen that remained. As the wild population continued to decline, it was clear that even if protective measures were put in place, the small size of the remaining population meant that the species was doomed. On the 22nd of May 2002, 2 photographs were taken of a dolphin swimming in the Yangtze. After analysis was complete, experts agreed that this was certainly a Baiji. Sadly, these photographs are the last confirmed evidence of the species existing in the wild. While sightings have persisted, none have been confirmed. The problem is that the Yangtze River is also home to the endangered Yangtze finless porpoise, so most reported sightings of Baiji are actually just cases of mistaken identity. On July 14, 2002, only 2 months after the last confirmed wild sighting of a Baiji, Kiki died, and with his death, the Baiji is assumed to have gone extinct. While it is possible that the species is still holding on undetected in the wild, it's incredibly unlikely. The Baiji is currently assessed as critically endangered by the IUCN, though it is presumed extinct. One of the most recognizable African animals is the zebra. Composed of 3 species, zebras are known for their bold black and white stripes. The most abundant species by far is the plain zebra, which has 5 or 6 recognized living subspecies. But in the not-so-distant past, there was a subspecies of plain zebra that didn't fit the mold. The quagga only lived in the southernmost parts of Africa, and were easily distinguished from other subspecies. While they did have the characteristic stripes, these were brown and white, and were limited to the head, neck, and shoulders. The rest of the body was a tan-brown color, and they had white on their bellies and legs. They could be found in large numbers in the Karoo of South Africa, probably living in herds of up to 50 animals. But as the Dutch began to settle in the region in the 17th century, the story of the end of the quagga began. The quagga were easily hunted, and as a result, large numbers were killed for their meat. On top of this, their skins became desirable for trading. European settlers brought with them guns, and local people too began to hunt the quagga with firearms in order to trade their skins. Quagga were also occasionally used on farms to help keep livestock safe from predators. The quaggas were seen as high-strung and lively, being unafraid of attacking intruders. They began to be sent to zoos around the world. Contrary to the reputation for being lively in Africa, in zoos they were viewed as being considerably tamer than Burchell's zebra, another subspecies of plain zebra. Because zoos preferred them, the London Zoo attempted to establish a quagga breeding program, but it proved too difficult and was eventually abandoned. Zoos continued to send to South Africa for new wild quaggas to be sent any time that their captive animals died. The only pictures that exist of living quagga were taken in the 1860s at the London Zoo. 5 pictures exist, all of the same mare in an enclosure with metal bars and a brick floor. In 1872, the quagga at the London Zoo died, leaving only 2 captive specimens, one in Berlin and one in Amsterdam. The London Zoo sent for another quagga, but for some reason none were being sent. In 1875, the Berlin quagga died, leaving the one at the Amsterdam Zoo as the last one in Europe. Almost nothing is known about her, as her existence was not considered remarkable. No one in Europe understood the state of the quagga in the wild. On August 12, 1883, she died, and now several zoos in Europe were waiting for news from South Africa regarding their replacements. As it turns out, none would ever come. By the 1850s, the quagga were gone from the Karoo. One small population remained to the northeast, on the other side of the Orange River, but they too were hunted to extinction in the 1870s. Some assumed that the animals would be found north of the Vaal River, but it turns out that with the decimation of the last population in the 1870s, the quagga had gone extinct in the wild. The mare at the Amsterdam Zoo was actually the endling. Countless people who strolled past her enclosure had no idea that she was, at the time, among the rarest animals on Earth. Naturalist Henry Bryden would later write that an animal so beautiful, so capable of domestication and use, and to be found not long since in so great abundance, should have been allowed to be swept from the face of the earth, is surely a disgrace to our latter-day civilization. Interestingly, the gene for quagga coloration persists in the surviving plain zebra population. As a result, a project to breed zebras so that they look as much as possible like the quagga was begun in 1987. Wild zebras with reduced striping on the hind part of their bodies were chosen and carefully bred in favor of quagga characteristics. Today, the program has produced a significant number of zebras with quagga coloration, and the hope is that the animals could be restored to the Karoo alongside wildebeest and ostriches in an effort to restore the environment to what it once was. The Galapagos giant tortoise is one of the largest tortoises in the world, reaching weights of as much as 417 kilograms or 919 pounds. The species is spread across the 18 major islands of the Galapagos. Due to the prolonged separation on the different islands, as many as 15 subspecies have developed, the majority of which are named after the island in which they're found. One such subspecies was the Pinta Island tortoise. In 1535, Tomás de Berlanga set sail from Panama for Peru, but a storm pushed his ship out to sea. He and his crew were likely the first people to ever set foot on the Galapagos Islands. What they found was an abundance of unique wildlife that was totally unafraid of people. There were large colonies of nesting seabirds, aquatic iguanas, penguins, and of course, giant tortoises. Long ocean journeys were dangerous and often led to the deaths of many sailors. Food was a constant concern. Whenever an island with abundant wildlife was found, it was noted for future sailors. Throughout the ensuing centuries, countless ships stopped by the islands in order for their crews to eat some fresh protein. The tortoises were particularly popular because they could be kept alive on the ships for long periods of time and eaten at a later date. They were hunted non-stop, with an estimated 200,000 taken from the Galapagos over the centuries. In the 1800s, the tortoises began to be transported to zoos around the world to be put on display, and by the end of the century, the Pinta Island tortoises were almost gone. With so few animals spread out across the island, their numbers continued to fall, and in the 1950s, the final blow was delivered. Goats were released on the island and began to breed prolifically. They ate through all of the island's vegetation, and it was believed that the Pinta Island tortoise had gone extinct. That is until 20 years later, in 1971, when a single Pinta Island tortoise was discovered still surviving on the island. He was moved to the Charles Darwin Research Station on Santa Cruz Island and placed under the care of Fausto Llerena. Researchers continue to look for any other surviving members of the subspecies, including in zoos around the world, but none was ever found. This single male was the last of his kind. He was given the name Lonesome George. While we aren't certain why George was selected, it's believed that he was named after the American comedic actor George Gobel. Throughout the 70s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s, George remained on Santa Cruz Island waiting for another of his kind to be found. It was decided that in the meantime, attempts should be made to try to at least get him to mate with females of a similar subspecies, so that some hybrid offspring could be produced. In the early 2000s, 2 female wolf volcano giant tortoises were placed in his enclosure. In 2008, he mated with one of them, and she produced 13 eggs. But within a few months, it was clear that all of the eggs were not viable. In 2009, he mated again, this time producing 5 eggs, but once again, none of them were viable. It was determined that the wolf volcano giant tortoises were not the most closely related subspecies. So in 2011, the females were switched with Hispaniola Island giant tortoises. But George would never mate again. On June 24, 2012, Fausto Llerena, who had been caring for Lonesome George for 42 years, found him dead in his enclosure. He had died of natural causes, and was estimated to have been over 100 years old. His remains were taxidermied and put on display in the Ecuadorian capital, Quito, before eventually being flown back to the Galapagos, where they are currently housed at the Fausto Llerena Breeding Center, named after the man who dedicated his life to caring for the Pinta Island tortoise's endling. But the story has one final twist. As it turns out, Isabella Island, the largest island in the chain, had been a dumping ground for tortoises collected by sailors from all of the other islands. A genetic survey of 1,600 tortoises in 2011 and 2012 showed an interesting result. 17 tortoises from around Wolf Volcano were shown to be 50% Pinta Island tortoise. Most interestingly, 5 of them were juvenile, which meant that it was likely that at least one pure Pinta Island tortoise remained alive on Wolf Volcano. While that pure tortoise hasn't been found, there are hopes that the 17 hybrids can be used to breed the Pinta Island tortoise back and return the subspecies to Pinta Island. The island was declared goat-free in 2003, and the vegetation has made a comeback. All that's missing now is the giant tortoise that once called the island home. And that's it for today's video. Let me know of any other endlings you've heard of in the comments below. I need to say a special thanks to my patrons. Without their ongoing support, I wouldn't be able to produce a video like this every week. If you want to support the channel, consider joining us on Patreon. The link is in the video description below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.